Hey everybody, this is Grant Burgess, and we are on week 5 of Hip Hop and Downtempo in Ableton. And this week we are still going to learn a few new things, but we're going to be taking it slower, at least for this week, just so that we really get all of the ideas that we covered in week 3 and week 4 really cemented, so that when we get to week 6, which is where we're going to kind of be starting from scratch with new samples, and some new ideas, and then we're going to be getting into effects and VST and how to arrange whole pieces. We really want to kind of look at sampling really closely and get the finer points down so that when we move on, we have a really good foundation. Last week, we wrote in a different pattern here for the Galt McDermott sample, and the one that I did, if it's like the one you did, sounds like this. And so on. We also learned about quantizing and how to work these different scenes. So if you're not real comfortable with that yet, please go back and watch those. Today, this week, what I want to talk about, I want to kind of get into a new thing, a different kind of sampling. Instead of slicing up these long samples like this, where we have the long sample and we put it into all these different pads, I want to talk about sampling a single sound. But before we do that, there's one trick that I learned when it came to sampling with slices like this that I really like, and I'd like to make sure you kind of have in your back pocket as soon as possible. Sometimes when you slice a sample, you get a little gap toward the end. So let's pretend, we're going to go ahead and take this one out so that we can kind of hear the problem that I'm going to create. So we're going to remove this so that it just plays the first sample all the way through and then starts it again on bar 2. So there was a little bit of a problem in there because there's a gap. It doesn't quite line up. Now let's make the gap worse. So if we go in, and you don't have to do this. This is actually, I'm just kind of showing you a problem you may run into in the future. If you want to do this just to see how to get it done, that makes perfect sense too. But I'm going to bring this back so that the end of the slice itself is just not going to play all the way through. So now, if I press play. So we hear that gap in between the first and second MIDI notes in there. So there are a couple of ways to fix that, but since we're working with a particular pitch, we don't want to retranspose all this, because remember, if you slow this down so that it would take longer to play through, the tempo wouldn't match our drums. And if we had any other instruments, like if we had like a bass sound in here or another sample on top of it, which is something we're going to do this week, you don't want to really adjust those things. So how do you fill that gap in? So there are a couple of easy ways, and the first easy way to do it would be if you fill in, so the space is happening somewhere in between the first and the second notes. So we're going to kind of see where that happens. I'll press play real quick. Okay, so somewhere right in here, it's turning off. Now, if we put another clip in there, and let's make sure the volume's all the way up on that too, that'll fill in the space, and that might sound all right. Yeah, that's okay, but you might not want to do that for every single one. So a trick that I like to use is it's called a reverse sustain mode, and how it works is it plays the track all the way through, and if the track's still supposed to be playing, it'll actually reverse. So I'll kind of show you what I mean. If you have a fuller version of Ableton Live 9, you'll be able to right-click on the device itself. Now that you can't right-click over here or anywhere else. You have to actually click on this slice itself. And if you right click, you can go from simpler to sampler. Now those are two different sampler instruments in Ableton. 9 times out of 10 I'm going to be using sampler. I like its features a little bit more. But if you're having this particular problem, go from simpler to sampler, and you'll see it looks pretty similar, but you've got some added features and a little bit different layout. So if you look down here in sustain mode, you'll see that there are 3 different ways that sampler sustains a track. So the first one is where it doesn't really sustain it at all. It plays it once through and then it stops it. The second one is where it loops it, so it'll play it all the way through, and then once it gets to the end, it'll go back to the beginning and play it again, and it'll just keep looping it forward. And then the third option is the kind of reverse sustain, or the back and forth. And what that does is that plays the track all the way through and then plays it in reverse. And sometimes that's a really cool thing to let that play out for a long time, and it starts to sound really weird. But for this purpose, what we're doing is we're just going to want it to loop just the very end here, just so that it can kind of patch over this gap, this bit that we're losing here. We're going to go ahead and press that, and when you do, you'll get then it looks just like when you're chopping a sample. So if you press it, now you've got so these arrows here in the bottom are what defined your sample itself. The bracket, the arrows on the top, this is what's going to define your loop. Sometimes it'll end up looking like this, and you want it to be all the way out. This is used for crossfades, and there's some other applications for this, but we're not really interested in it. So if I play, I'm actually just going to play it from the sampler itself. So if I play it, so you can see it kind of playing back and forth. Well, when it's put in this application, where it really only has, a 1/8 note to cover, it's pretty fast and it's not that easy to hear. So let's take a listen to this where we had that really nasty gap in there. So you see it kind of holds that note out. It sounds a little awkward, but sometimes it works really well. And I would actually maybe even keep this or play around with it a little bit more. But this is a pretty good fix for gaps in between your samples. So that is a good way to get through that problem. I'm going to try and get us back to sounding all right. I'm going to move this to where it's supposed to be. That looks pretty close. Let's take a listen. Yeah, there's still a little bit of a gap in there. So what I would do, just by virtue of there being a gap for one reason or another, I would go ahead and hit that sustain mode just so that there's a little bit of coverage there. And again, if you can see, the bracket doesn't reach all the way to the end of the sample, so I'll drag it out there. And so now that should fix even that natural gap that was in there. Yeah, it's not too bad. It could sound better, but we're not going to worry too much about it right now. What I want to move on to is sampling a single sound, or rather than having these slices like this, where you've got the individual bits of a longer sample. I actually want to take a smaller sample and be able to play that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this track, and then in the week 5 folder, you should have 2 things. First thing is this acapella from Inspect a Deck, and you can find this on YouTube, I'm pretty sure. And then you can also find the Laurent Voulzy, I think that's how you'd say his name, the gliding hand sample, which we're going to use in the latter part of this video. So first, I want to pull the Inspect a Deck onto a new audio track here, and it'll create the track. And then when you open it up, you see here is the entire acapella. The acapella is just
killer hell, killer hell, killer hells, killer hell.
So there's no music behind it, and that's exactly what we want. For this particular track, I've gone ahead and figured out exactly what we want to take out of it. So remember, you don't want to be warped. You just want this raw track. So for this, there is a part where he says lose control. And that's what I want to use for this sample. So that happens right around the 55th second. So we'll zoom in, and we'll get 54 so we can hear it come in. And we're going to press play.
Back with a roadblock, I might lose control.
Okay, so somewhere in here.
Might lose control.
And we just want lose control. So remember, we're pulling the bottom, not the top, arrow in, and press play.
Lose control.
That sounds good. So let's zoom out and let's drag the right side in so that we can just have that piece. We just want that soundbite in there. It looks like there's a little breath you see right after that. So let's see if we take that out, if it still sounds natural.
Lose control.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So now that we have all this stuff we don't want and this little tiny bit that we do want, you just right-click and crop a sample. Now, some of you know, because of the way that your version of Ableton is set up, that you can just drag, once you have a clip, an audio clip set up the way that you want, you can just drag it into, I could drag it into this drum rack here and put it there, and it would retain all of the, like, so if I put that in there, you'll see it's just this part that I cut. So that's, go ahead and undo that. That's an option. You can just move audio clips to other instruments, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So if we go over into instruments, we're going to want to pull in sampler. If you have a version of Ableton that only has simpler, most of this is going to look the exact same to you. You may have to look around for buttons in different places that do the same things, but it's about the same thing. So we just drag a new sampler track out, and it gives us this. So you might notice that if we look in the Galt McDermott chops, these are all these are actually simpler tracks, but except for the one that we changed. These are all individual simpler or sampler tracks, and they're all grouped in together into this drum rack. And that's what drum rack does, is it groups samplers. So when you have a sampler by itself, now you can drag any track you want into it. So we're going to grab this inspected deck where we just chopped the lose control part. We're going to open up the sampler, and we're just going to drag the track in. So now, if we arm this track, and we just
Lose control. Lose control. Lose control.
yeah, so
Lose control.
it's real quiet, but that is the original pitch. If you're playing the, I believe, C2, that is the original pitch
Lose control.
and speed of the original sample. You can turn the volume up here. I prefer to do that.
Lose control. Lose control.
So that sounds pretty good. I already went ahead and figured out exactly what note works with the tempo of this song. So when we're working with these sampler bits, there are kind of two things that you want to figure out. If you're using a rap sample, like an acapella sample, the pitch doesn't matter as much as the timing. So if I were to play these drums, I'll just play the quieter breakbeat drums. Okay, so if I were to play those and then to trigger at C2, just at the natural tempo of the sample, if I were to trigger the sample, let's see if it's in time well.
Lose control. Lose control.
It's actually not bad, but I found that A sharp 2,
Lose control.
it's a little lower sounding, but it doesn't sound particularly unnatural, and it lines up with the tempo a lot better.
Lose control. Lose control.
So that sounds good to me. So that is A sharp 2. If you have this exact same setup on your machine, I would recommend doing that. If you don't like the way it sounds, if you want it to be slower or faster, go for that. So what I want to do is I want to play this whole scene 3. So I'm gonna press play on it. So now that it's ready, now I just have to press space, and the whole thing will play. And I want to record this little lose control part from Inspected Deck. So I'm just going to, because my track's armed, I'm just going to press the record button here, and I'm going to put it down wherever I think it sounds right.
Lose control. Lose control.
Yeah, something real simple like that. With these, you can quantize these, and it looks like this is pretty close to the right place, and so is this. But You really have to decide if you want to quantize them, because sometimes they sound better the way you played them. So it is a little quiet, so I'm going to turn it up here. And then let's listen to them together.
Lose control. Lose control.
All right, and I do want this actually to be right in the line. It sounds better. So I'm just going to drag it over. I could quantize, but I'll just drag it by hand. So it's a little loud now, so I'll bring it down to, I don't know, 15 decibels. So now we have got this vocal sample over the top, and that's one of the things you can do with Sampler. The other thing that you can do with Sampler, I'm going to go ahead and stop all these clips, is you can bring in a musical sample. So if we go here to the gliding hand sample, and we bring that in, just like we did with the Inspector Deck, and we take a listen to it. So I like that, just that first part. It's real, a lot of digital compression on this one, but I like that first part. So we'll just grab these bottom arrows and bring it in. Now I want to see if I can get that higher note without the lower note. Now there are ways to do that with an EQ, and we will get there later on in the course, or with the more advanced videos. But I think the end, toward the end of that sample or that sound, the bass kind of rolled off pretty well. So let's take a listen to just this last part. Yeah, that sounds okay to me. It could be better, but we're not going to fuss about it too much. So we're going to crop this sample just the same. Now it's really quiet, so we're going to want to have to turn up the volume in the sampler. But let's go back into instruments. Let's bring in another sampler, and let's just drag this in. So yeah, you can see how quiet it is. Let's turn the volume significantly up. We're going to turn the arm off of the Inspector Deck sampler and turn it on to the gliding hand sampler, and then let's take a listen. Yeah, so that sounds like a note we can work with. Now, again, I went ahead and I figured out what the best note would be for this, and it is A2. That's what matches the Galt McDermott sample really well. There are a bunch of notes. You can play this like a keyboard, so if you find the right notes, there's a whole scale that'll fit with it. But let's listen to, I'm going to turn it up just a little bit more. Let's listen to this sample. I'm going to play A2. We'll listen to the sample with all the rest of the stuff. That sounds pretty close. If you want to really get in there and tune it well, this detune function down here in the bottom left, that can be really helpful. And there are some things with, you can obviously change your root key, but you don't really need to do that. And we can get into the snap function later. But remember the reverse sustain mode that we had. If we turn that on and we play, we're not going to play the samples, we'll just play the note. You see it just plays back and forth, and you can just hold that note down the entire time. And I think that's what we'll do. So we're going to hit record on this, and it's going to give me a bar, and then we'll be recording. I'm just going to hold that note down and see how it sounds. Okay, so let's go ahead and quantize that. Right click, quantize, and let's play all of them together to make sure that they sound right. Lose control. Lose control. All right, so that's how you bring in samples, vocal samples, musical samples. The possibilities get really endless really quickly when it comes to bringing in these little added touches and stuff. And you can, if you want to bring in a cymbal and you want it to be completely separate from the drum rack, and you want it to have a special effect on it or play in a certain way or whatever, you would use Sampler or Simpler to do that. So now that we have drums and samples and chopping and using Sampler and bringing in vocal samples and musical samples, that's where we're going to stop as far as new things for now. Next week, we're going to get in. We're just going to kind of start over with all new stuff, and we're going to do all of this again so that we don't have to keep listening to the same track week after week, and also so that we can maybe run into new problems and new successes and figure out how to work through all of that. But I think that's enough for this week. I will see you guys next week. Peace.